The annexation of Texas by the United States in 1845 set the U.S. on a collision course with Mexico. The Mexican-American War of 1846-1848 resulted in a resounding American victory, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, which ended the conflict, transferred control of more than 500,000 square miles of territory from Mexico to the United States. Along with land gained from the Gadsden Purchase of 1853, the U.S. claimed territory which included all of the present states of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, along with parts of the present states of Colorado and Wyoming. The California Gold Rush of 1849 and a later gold rush to Colorado in 1859 drew large numbers of Americans into the new territories and highlighted the importance of their mineral wealth. The secession of the southern states and the formation of the Confederate States of America in February 1861 directed most attention to the east. However, Henry Hopkins Sibley, a former major in the 2nd U.S. Dragoons and a newly minted brigadier general in the Confederate Army, secured permission from Confederate President Jefferson Davis to raise a brigade of 3 regiments of Texas Mounted Volunteers and seize the New Mexico Territory from the Union. Sibley argued that New Mexico was lightly defended and disorganized, and he believed that a Confederate force could subsist on supplies captured from Union-held forts and supply depots in the territory. In essence, he proposed to wage a campaign on the cheap. In the meantime, a battalion of the 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles under Lieutenant Colonel John R. Baylor seized the initiative and took control of southeast New Mexico. After defeating a Union force of 380 troops under Major Isaac Lind in a battle near Fort Fillmore on July 24, 1861. Baylor announced the creation of the Confederate Territory of Arizona, with its capital located at Mesilla. Confederate Arizona theoretically encompassed all of the Union New Mexico territory below 34 degrees latitude, though actual Confederate control was limited to the territory immediately around Mesilla and Tucson. Faced with attacks from Native Americans as well as a Union advance on a small battalion, Baylor was unable to advance any further, and he asked for reinforcements to consolidate Confederate control over the territory and to continue the conquest. The small United States Army was needed in the east, where Union forces already faced daunting military problems. Little consideration was taken of threats to western territories, and concentration of Army regulars meant stripping most U.S. Army forts in the west of their garrisons, and maintaining only the most important posts. Native Americans, emboldened by the U.S. withdrawal, quickly began to press their advantage, with the result that both the Union and Confederate forces faced dual enemies. Despite the multiple threats to New Mexico at large and the weakening of U.S. Army organization due to the resignation of most officers from the South, Union forces maintained a firm hold on the heart of the territory, the valley of the Rio Grande, ably led by Colonel Edward R.S. Canby. Union regulars, volunteers, and militia concentrate at Fort Craig along the Rio Grande River in position to block any Confederate advance northward. As Canby gathers his forces in the New Mexico territory, Brigadier General Sibley raises the 4th, 5th, and 7th Texas Mounted Rifle Regiments, along with 3 batteries of artillery to serve in his newly minted Army of New Mexico. Recruited predominantly from southeastern Texas, horses and equipment are a problem from the start. Stocks of captured Union supplies are quickly exhausted, and many soldiers resort to bringing their own horses and weapons with them. Rifles are in short supply, and many Confederate soldiers are equipped with shotguns, of limited use except for at close range. Some troops even embarked on the campaign armed with old European-style lances. In October of 1861, Sibley divides his brigade-sized Army of New Mexico into smaller detachments for the movement west, in large part due to the scarcity of water along the line of march. The immediate objective of Sibley's New Mexico campaign is to conquer the Union-held New Mexico territory, with stockpiles of supplies at Fort Union as the ultimate prize. But Sibley also expresses grander designs. Sibley believes that Southern California contains many secessionists who will gladly overthrow the government there and join the Confederacy if given the opportunity. Mineral wealth from the gold and silver mines of Colorado, California, and other parts of the West might also help to finance the Confederates' war for independence, if those areas can be seized. The seizure of the state of California also holds out prospect of gaining control of unblockaded ports on the Pacific, such as Los Angeles and San Francisco. These goals are entrusted to Colonel James Riley of the 4th Texas Mounted Rifles, who would lead a diplomatic mission into Mexico while Sibley and his army marched northward. Because of the large tracts of territory involved and the small Confederate force, Southern prospects for success depends heavily on the support of local populations and, most importantly, on the acquisition of supplies to continue the campaign. The Confederate troops began their march westward towards Mesilla, New Mexico, via Fort Bliss, Texas, in early November 1861, and the last detachments arrived there in late December. On December 20th, 1861, Sibley issues a proclamation to the people of the New Mexico Territory, the southern portion of which is styled as the Confederate Territory of Arizona. The proclamation, designed to placate the local population, includes promises of security and payment for needed supplies. These promises are almost immediately violated, as some of the Texas troops simply take what they need from the local inhabitants. Sibley warns the local men against aiding the Union. However, the significant numbers of New Mexico troops in Colonel Canby's gathering Union forces indicates that his warning goes unheeded. In February, after incorporating Lieutenant Colonel Baylor's battalion of the 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles and some locally recruited Confederate companies into his command, Sibley's newly styled Army of New Mexico moves northward up the Rio Grande River towards Union-held Fort Craig. Sibley's strategy depends on the capturing of Union clothing, munitions, and food. The Confederate Army carries few supplies with it, and foraging offers limited gains because of the harsh environment of the New Mexico desert country. Indeed, the valley of the Rio Grande is the principal productive area of the territory, but supplies would quickly be exhausted by the thousands of Confederate troops if they foraged liberally on the crops and goods needed for the support of the New Mexican population who already lived there. Sibley needs to seize Fort Craig in order to resupply his army at the expense of the Federals, as well as to keep his lines of communication and supply open as he marches northwards. Colonel Edward Canby remains aware of Confederate movements and strength through the efforts of active Union patrols. However, Canby doubts the reliability of the New Mexico volunteers and territorial militia called up to augment his regular army troops. Canby had already withheld several companies of regulars from the recall to the east, and the questionable quality of the volunteers and militia preoccupies him during the early months of 1862. Colonel Canby's Federal Department of New Mexico and Brigadier General Sibley's Army of New Mexico first meet in action at the Battle of Valverde, or Battle of Valverde Ford, on February 20th to 21st, 1862. Sibley's army wins a tactical victory at this battle. However, Valverde is a strategic failure for the Confederates. Sibley's army sustains 10% casualties, but it fails to interdict Union supplies and fails to take Fort Craig, with its stockpile of provisions. In a campaign based on the acquisition of supplies, anything less than a complete victory amounts to a loss. Union losses at the Battle of Valverde were 17% casualties, in addition to the loss of 6 artillery pieces led by Captain Alexander McRae. Colonel Canby knows that control of Fort Craig is paramount to the security of the region, and while the tactical loss at Valverde is demoralizing, the regular army officer knows that time and circumstances favor his own army. In short, Colonel Canby can afford to wait for more favorable circumstances. After Canby rejects a demand for the surrender of Fort Craig, Sibley undertakes a strategic gamble by leaving a large enemy force in a well-supplied fortification in his rear, astride his lines of communication and supply with the Mesilla Valley and San Antonio. In reality, Brigadier General Sibley has no real choice, since he could not settle into a siege to reduce the fort, lest he lose its vital supplies, and he needed to continue the campaign and seize food, clothing, and munitions in federal caches farther north. Following the Battle of Valverde, Canby sends a staff officer north with orders to destroy all supplies and munitions in the path of the advancing Confederate army. However, Sibley's army manages to gain possession of hundreds of rifled muskets and foodstuffs when they defeat a regiment of New Mexico militia north of Fort Craig. The Texas troops find an empty supply depot at Polvadera and continues their advance to Albuquerque, which they occupy on March 2nd. When added to additional provisions captured in the area, Sibley estimates that the stocks confiscated from Albuquerque will feed his troops for 3 months. Continuing the northward march, Major Charles Pyron's battalion of the 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles occupies Santa Fe on March 13th. The Texas troops suffer much from the cold winter weather during the nights, especially since they lack adequate tents and overcoats to protect them from the overnight elements. By this point, the fighting in the campaign was reduced to small skirmishes, and General Sibley takes the opportunity to rest his men before resuming the march northward. While Sibley concerns himself with resupplying his army at the expense of federal stockpiles and resting his men, Union troops in the Colorado Territory marched south to meet the rebel invaders. Colorado had already sent 2 companies of troops to fight for the Union in New Mexico, one of which was destroyed in a lancer charge by the 5th Texas Mounted Rifles at the Battle of Valverde. Arrhenius reports that this company had been destroyed at the battle spurred the territory into action. Thus, the 1st Colorado Volunteer Infantry Regiment, commanded by a Denver lawyer named Colonel John P. Slough, was dispatched to Colonel Canby's command in New Mexico. By the time they had arrived at their post in Fort Union, the Confederates' ultimate goal of the campaign, the 1st Colorado had gained itself a reputation for rowdiness, having raided the sutler's stores in the post. In order to keep his men preoccupied, Colonel Slough soon adopts a policy of raiding against the enemy and sets out with his troops for Bernal Springs, from where his men can harass Confederate troops advancing from Santa Fe. The troops in Slough's advance consist of his own 1st Colorado, as well as a composite battalion formed from an independent Colorado Infantry Company and the 5th U.S. Infantry, a battalion of regular U.S. cavalry, and 2 batteries of artillery. The total force consists of just over 1,300 troops. Major Charles L. Pyron, in command of Confederate troops at Santa Fe, learns of Colonel Slough's movement and sets out to contest the federal advance with 300 troops of his own 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles and additional companies of the 5th Texas Mounted Rifles. These Union and Confederate forces are set on a collision course towards Glorieta Pass outside Santa Fe. The Confederates encamp at Johnson's Ranch, near the mouth of Apache Canyon. At the same time, Colonel Slough assigns Major John Chivington to lead a column of 400 men on a raid towards Santa Fe. The Union troops encamp at Kozlowski's Ranch, close enough to the Confederate soldiers that enemy pickets are reported in the area. The area is confined, with steep slopes on either side of the Santa Fe Trail, which runs along its bottom. The Battle of Glorieta Pass begins on March 26, 1862, when Major Chivington's troops march west down into Apache Canyon towards the Confederate encampment at Johnson's Ranch. As they advance, they capture the Confederate pickets, which enables them to surprise Major Pyron's Texas Battalion, which had been reinforced by 2 artillery pieces. Chivington deploys troops on the slopes of either side of his position in an effort to envelop the enemy line, and the Confederates give way, retreating back down the canyon towards their own advancing reinforcements. Continuing the pursuit down Apache Canyon, Chivington deploys his troops in a similar fashion to the earlier fight, and after a brief engagement which includes a futile Union cavalry charge, the Texas troops retreat back towards Johnson's ranch, from where they started that morning. The battle in Apache Canyon results in minimal casualties, but the most significant result of the action is the Confederate loss of a quarter of their troops as prisoners. To secure the prisoners, refill canteens, and water the stock, Chivington orders a withdrawal to his morning's position at Kozlowski's ranch. The fighting at Apache Canyon has ended in a Union success, largely due to the capture of the Confederate pickets, which had allowed them the element of surprise in the attack. The Texans fared poorly, losing a large number of prisoners, but the day's action is not decisive. Both sides are now aware of the close proximity of their opponents, and they soon gather reinforcements to renew the battle. The next day, March 27th, is largely spent gathering more forces for a larger fight set for the following day. Colonel Slough prepares for his own advance down the Santa Fe Trail by organizing his troops into two units. The mounted troops, 5 companies of the 1st Colorado, and the 2 batteries of artillery, about 800 troops in all, form the main column under Slough's direct control. The remainder of the command, nearly 500 troops, are placed under Major John Chivington's command for use as a flanking force. Meanwhile, Major Pyron's command is reinforced by a battalion of the 7th Texas Mounted Rifles and most of the 4th Texas Mounted Rifles under Lieutenant Colonel William R. Scurry, who assumes overall command of the Confederate force, which now numbers roughly 1,200 troops. Colonel Slough sends Major Chivington's column on a march to the southwest while he takes the main column through Glorieta Pass. Federal cavalry meets the advancing Texas troops late in the morning on March 28th, and the Battle of Glorieta Pass thus resumes. Unlike the fighting in Apache Canyon 2 days before, the Confederates now seize the initiative, and the Union troops under Colonel Slough assumes a defensive posture for the duration of the battle, as they await the expected flank attack from Chivington's battalion. Slough deploys his troops on either side of the road at Pigeon's Ranch, with the 2 batteries of artillery in the center. The Union commander attempts to flank the attacking Confederates by advancing a company on either side of the slopes to the right and left of the road, along the bottom. But the effort fails when the Texan counterattacks drive the Union companies back towards the position of the artillery in the center of the line. The 1st Colorado troops fall back to Pigeon's Ranch, where Slough begins to dismount some of his cavalry reserve for placement on the flanks to support his infantry. Union forces on the right hold back a Texan assault, but the Federal right flank falls back under the weight of another attack, which exposes the 2 Union batteries in the bottom of the pass to enfilading fire. The Federal forces retreat for a second time, abandoning Pigeon's Ranch to Scurry's force. They then gather at Kozlowski's ranch, the location of their camp 2 days prior. Throughout the Battle of Glorieta Pass, Colonel Slough awaits word from Chivington's flanking force. The column's mission was to launch a flanking attack, and though the Union force remained intact and retreated in good order, Scurry's Texans have won a tactical victory and hold the field. Both Slough and Scurry keep their supply trains relatively close at hand during the battle, though the Federal train remains directly behind the battle lines. Indeed, the Union wagons come under fire during the retreat, and 2 of them are burned to prevent them from falling into Confederate hands. To protect his own logistical support, Scurry leaves his supply train at Johnson's ranch, miles to the rear, where they are presumed safe from Union capture. In the vast western expanse and sparse population of New Mexico, the efforts of both sides of the conflict heavily depend on their supplies. Before Slough's troops advanced westward on the morning of March 28th, Major Chivington's battalion moved to the southwest. guided by Lieutenant Colonel Manuel Antonio Chavez of the 2nd New Mexico Volunteers and a native of the area around Glorieta Pass. Chivington's force arrives on the high ground above Johnson's ranch in the early afternoon of that same day. From their position on the cliffs above the ranch, Chivington and Colonel Chavez have a spectacular view of the entire Confederate supply train. Scurry believes the train is safe, so far behind the lines, and he has left only a couple hundred troops to guard it. Most of the guards are sick, wounded, or otherwise unable to join the main force fighting Slough's troops, and their assignment as supply train guards is considered suitable light duty. Major Chivington's troops descend from the sheer cliffs in half an hour's time, and they scatter the scratch force of Texas troops protecting the train. With the loss of only a few of his own soldiers, Chivington secures Scurry's supply train, concentrates the wagons, and burns them together with their contents. Rather than risk an attack on the Confederate rear, Chivington's battalion returns to Kozlowski's ranch to reunite with Colonel Slough's main column. Exhausted, and with half of their field officers dead or wounded, the Confederates are unable to pursue. The battle is over. The Confederate Army of New Mexico wins a tactical victory at the Battle of Glorieta Pass, but the victory is barren of strategic results. Slough's retreat to Kozlowski's ranch leaves Scurry in control of the battlefield, which allows him to claim victory. However, Chivington's destruction of the Texas supply train spells disaster for the Confederates. Already suffering from hunger and the elements of winter in the southwestern desert, the Texas troops are hundreds of miles into enemy territory, beyond the reach of resupply or reinforcements. After hearing of the loss of the supply train, Scurry makes the difficult decision to withdraw his force back to Santa Fe rather than continue the push towards Fort Union. In the aftermath of Glorieta Pass, the Confederates are so destitute of equipment that, during a truce after the action, they are forced to borrow tools from Slough's Colorado troops to bury their own dead. By April of 1862, Sibley's New Mexico campaign was already taking a turn for the worse. Although they had won every major battle thus far, the strategic situation is dire for Sibley's Army of New Mexico. With Colonel Slough's force threatening him from the north and Colonel Canby's forces moving on his location from the south, he faced encirclement and destruction. The Confederates soon abandoned Santa Fe and eventually the New Mexico territory entirely. Although the Battle of Glorieta Pass is a tactical Confederate victory, it is a decisive strategic victory for the Union. The Gettysburg of the West, as the battle is sometimes romantically dubbed, would help secure the Union's hold over the New Mexico territory and the entire region of the southwestern United States for the remainder of the war.